The corridor smelled of beeswax and boiled linen, the same smell it had smelled every morning for 7 years, and Eleanor Vance would remember that smell for the rest of her life as the smell of being erased. "You will vacate by nightfall." Mr. Harlow did not look up from the ledger as he said it, his pen still wet, the ink of her dismissal not yet dry enough to be called permanent, though it already was. He was head footman, and he had practiced the sentence in his mouth for a week. She was sure of it, the way a man practices a lie until it no longer tastes like one. "I have taken nothing," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than her hands, which were laced together at her waist to stop them shaking. "The Duchess's garnet pin was found sewn into the lining of your work apron." Harlow turned a page. "Sewn, Vance. Not dropped. Not slipped. Sewn." She had not sewn it there. She knew, with the flat certainty of someone watching a door close from the wrong side, exactly whose needle had done that stitching, and exactly why, because she had seen Harlow's hand in the plate room 3 weeks past, seen it linger too long near the silver count, and she had said nothing, because saying something to a duke's household about a head footman was like whispering into a hurricane and expecting to be heard over it. Now the hurricane had turned and found her anyway. The Duchess received her in the small morning room, sitting very straight in blue silk, and she did not raise her eyes from her needlework once during the whole of it. Eleanor watched the Duchess's needle go in, and out, and in, small silver flashes, while Harlow read the accusation aloud a second time as if once had not been cruelty enough. The Duchess's silence was its own kind of verdict. It was worse, in its way, than if she had shouted. Shouting would have meant she cared enough to be angry. This was simply administration. The Duke came in only at the end, already dressed for riding, smelling of leather and cold air, a man in a hurry to be elsewhere. He did not ask her name. He glanced at Harlow, who murmured something about the girl's belongings being gathered, and the Duke's eyes fell, briefly, distractedly, on a battered walnut writing box sitting on the side table, water-stained along one edge, its brass corners tarnished, a thing that had clearly been pulled from some forgotten trunk in the attics and never missed. "See, she's given something for her trouble," he said, already turning for the door, already thinking of horses. "That'll do. Nobody wants it." 7 years of her hands, scrubbing this house's stone floors raw, hauling its coal, mending its linens by tallow light until her eyes burned, rising before the house's own roosters and lying down after its last candle guttered, 7 years, and what she was handed at the end of it was an insult shaped like an object, a box that smelled of mildew and had clearly sat unloved in some cold room for decades. She took it anyway, because pride does not put food in a stomach, and because it was, at least, something to carry that was hers and not theirs. She counted her wages in the scullery passage with her back against the cold brick, out of sight of the windows so that no one in the house could watch her do arithmetic with her own poverty. 4 shillings owed her, but Harlow had docked her for the theft of a pin she had never touched, docked her again for her uniform, which the housekeeper informed her, with something almost like pleasure, remained property of the estate, even the one she was presently wearing, so that she had to change, shivering, in the linen room into her own grey wool dress, worn thin at the elbows, while a scullery maid she'd trained herself 2 years back watched from the doorway and said nothing, too frightened of being seen to be kind. What was left, when it was all totted up and taken from and apologized for by no one, was 4.5 pence. She walked out past the scullery door as the light went the color of wet slate, her boots already soaked through from the yard's standing puddles, one carpet bag in her left hand holding the whole of her life, 2 dresses, a hairbrush worn down to its bristles, a cracked mirror, a Bible with her mother's name inside the cover in faded brown ink, and the walnut box wedged under her right arm, heavier than its size accounted for, banging against her hip with every step as though it, too, were trying to tell her something she wasn't yet able to hear. Behind her, Graymore Hall's windows lit one by one, gold and warm and utterly closed to her now, and she did not look back at them, because looking back had never once in her life gotten her anything but a stiff neck and a longer sorrow. The road to Thornfell ran through 11 miles of autumn woods, and by the third mile the last of the daylight had drained out of the sky entirely, leaving only the wet iron smell of coming frost and the crunch of her own footsteps in fallen beech leaves. Her stockings had rubbed raw against wet leather. Her arm ached from the box's dead weight. She stopped twice to shift it to the other side and once simply to stand still in the dark and breathe, hand pressed flat against a tree trunk rough with lichen, until the shaking in her chest passed and she could walk again. She reached Thornfell well past the ringing of the church bell for evening service, the village already shuttered and smoke-scented, chimneys breathing thin grey ribbons up into a black sky pricked with the first hard stars of the season. Mrs. Farrow's bakehouse was the only building still showing a working light, a low orange glow through a flour-dusted window, and the smell that reached Eleanor on the road, yeast and scorched sugar and coal-fired heat, was the first thing in hours that had made her stomach ache with something other than fear. Mrs. Farrow was broad through the shoulders from 40 years of kneading, flour worked so deep into the creases of her hands it had become a kind of permanent glove, and she took one look at Eleanor, soaked, hollow-eyed, carrying a carpet bag in a box like a woman carrying the only two things left of a whole drowned life, and did not ask a single question that would have cost the girl her dignity to answer. "Loft's warm," was all she said. "Ovens bank through the night. Penny for the straw, and mind you don't smoke up there. I've had the roof timbers seasoned 40 years and I'll not have some careless girl take them from me in an hour." The loft was low enough that Eleanor had to stoop beneath the beams, but the floorboards beneath her when she finally sat, boots off, stockinged feet curled beneath her, held a heat that came up through the wood itself, radiating from the ovens 2 floors below like the slow banked warmth of something alive. She ate a heel of yesterday's bread that Mrs. Farrow had pressed into her hand without being asked for it, and paid over 1 of her 4.5 pence for the privilege. It was uglier by lamplight than it had been in the Duke's cold morning room. The green baize lining the writing slope had cracked and lifted at one corner, gone the color of pond scum. The brass inkwell, when she worked its stiff little lid free, held nothing but a dead black crust, decades old. The veneer along the box's spine had warped and split where damp had gotten into it at some point in its long-neglected life, curling away from the pine carcass beneath like burnt skin. It was, in every visible particular, exactly what the Duke had called it. "Nobody wants it." She ran her thumb along the cracked baize anyway, out of nothing more than tiredness and the human habit of touching a thing to prove it is real, and that was when her thumb caught on a give in the wood that should not have been there. It was subtle. A servant's whole trade was noticing subtleties, the give of a floorboard that meant rot beneath, the particular creak of a door that told you who was coming before you saw them, and 7 years of that trade had put something into her hands that would not have been there in a woman who had never had to learn a house by feel in the dark. Beneath the baize, where the wood of the writing slope should have been flat and solid clear through, there was a softness. A shallow, wrong give, no more than the width of a coin, running along one edge where the lining met the box's frame. Her heart began to beat harder before her mind had finished deciding why. She fetched her sewing kit from the carpet bag with fingers that had gone clumsy, and from it a broken pen nib she'd carried for years, meaning always to have it mended and never doing so, and by the low banked light coming up through the floor she worked the nib's broken edge beneath the lifted corner of baize, easing it back millimeter by millimeter so as not to tear what little of the fabric still held. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 6, of a fever that took half the row she'd lived on that winter, and had left her daughter nothing but a Bible, a face Eleanor could no longer entirely picture without effort, and, it seemed now, impossibly, 12 years after the fact, a stone house and an orchard that no one, not the Duke, not Harlow, not the whole careless machinery of Greymoor Hall that had thrown her out with a mildewed box as a joke at her expense, had ever known was sitting hidden beneath a cracked square of green baize, waiting. She did not sleep that night so much as lie very still in the loft's banked warmth with the deed pressed flat against her chest beneath her folded hands, listening to the ovens tick below her, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember something that was not quite hope, because hope still felt too dangerous a thing to trust completely, but was at least its cousin, the sense that the ground beneath her which had been falling away for a full day now, had finally, quietly, stopped. Fenwick Croft, when she reached it 2 days later, footsore and coin-heavy and half disbelieving of her own map reading, was not the answer to a prayer so much as it was a problem with a roof. Bramble had taken the front garden entirely, grown up through what had once been a path in ropes as thick as a man's wrist, thorn entangled so densely that she had to fetch a billhook from the nearest farm just to reach her own front door. Half the windows stood empty of glass, black sockets staring out at an orchard gone to riot, apple and plum trees grown wild and unpruned for what looked like a decade or more, their branches so overgrown they had begun strangling each other for light. The roof had lost slates in a long diagonal scar across its south face, and when she finally forced the swollen front door on its rusted hinge, the smell that met her was damp stone and old ash and mouse and something underneath it all that she chose, standing there with her heart hammering, to call possibility rather than ruin. She did not fix it with money, though the sovereigns and the note bought her materials and time she would not otherwise have had. She fixed it the only way she had ever fixed anything in her life, which was with her own 2 hands, day after day, until her palms split and healed and split again into something tougher than they had been. Tom Ashby came up from the nearest farm the second week, a lean, weathered man of perhaps 50 who took one look at the roof's broken back and simply climbed it without being asked twice, working slates loose from a derelict barn 2 fields over with a patience that made Eleanor's own hurry look foolish by comparison. Roof first, he told her, straddling the ridge with a mouthful of nails, spitting them one at a time into his palm to drive them home. Everything else can wait on weather. A house with a bad roof isn't a house. It's a slow drowning with a door on it. Mrs. Cobb came the 3rd week, a widow from the mill cottages with forearms like a blacksmith's from decades of laundry work, and she took the flagstone floors in hand the way another woman might take a grudge, on her knees, sleeves rolled to the elbow, scrubbing years of soot and neglect out of the stone with lye water and a hard brush until the gray slabs came up pale gold beneath the grime, until you could see, Mrs. Cobb said, straightening with a hand pressed to the small of her back, what a floor's meant to look like when somebody's bothered to love it. Old Mr. Dunning found the bee skeps at the orchard's far end in the 4th week, 3 straw domes gone half to ruin but not entirely dead, a low determined hum still moving inside them like a held breath. He was past 70, hands spotted and knuckled thick with age, and he showed her, patiently, without ever once making her feel a fool for not knowing, how to move slow and low around the hives, how to read the pitch of the hum for temper or calm, how to smoke them gentle rather than harsh, how a colony that had been neglected could still, given enough careful attention, be coaxed back toward thriving. Bees don't forgive quick, he told her, but they don't hold a grudge forever either, if you're patient and you're honest with them. Rather like people, in that. He said it without looking at her when he said it, which was its own kind of kindness. At night, when the work stopped and the house sat around her half-mended and full of the day's dust, Eleanor would take from her apron pocket a small tin comb, its broken teeth soldered back together with an amateur's careful, ugly solderwork, the only thing of her father's she had ever owned, and turn it over in her fingers by candlelight, remembering hands that had mended it for her the year before he too was gone. Beside it on the mantel, she kept Mrs. Ellery's old wooden spoon, a gift pressed on her by the cook at Graymore Hall on her last morning there, worn smooth and dark with 40 years of stirring, the one act of quiet kindness that house had shown her on its way to throwing her out, and some nights she would simply stand and look at these 2 small, worn, unremarkable objects and feel something in her chest settle that she did not yet have better words for than this is mine, and no one gave it to me, and no one can take it back. By the time the apple trees had been cut back enough to fruit properly again, by the time the roof no longer wept onto the upstairs floorboards and the flags gleamed pale gold under Mrs. Cobb's scrubbing and the skeps hummed low and steady and calm under Mr. Dunning's patient tutoring, Eleanor Vance had stopped, somewhere in the long unglamorous middle of all that labor, being a girl running from a house that hadn't wanted her. She had become, instead, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, a woman standing on ground that was entirely her own. The village came to call her Miss Vance of Fenwick Croft before she had ever thought to ask it of anyone, the way a place will sometimes name a thing correctly before the person living it has caught up to the truth of their own life. She sold honey from Mr. Dunning's revived skeps at the Thornfell market on Thursdays, apples from the untangled orchard through the autumn, and kept the 100-pound note largely untouched in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard of her own devising, not out of fear now, but out of the plain good sense of a woman who intended never again to stand in a cold corridor with 4.5 and nothing else to her name. On the evenings when the work was done and the light went long and gold across the orchard, she would sit on the mended stone step with her father's comb warm in her pocket and Mrs. Ellery's spoon on the sill above her and the low steady hum of the hives drifting to her on the last of the day's warmth, and she understood, in the unshowy way a person comes to understand the deepest truths of their own life, not in a single blinding instant but slowly, across many ordinary evenings just like this one, that she had not been given Fenwick Croft. She had earned it twice. Once, unknowing, by the mother who had hidden it for her against some danger she could no longer ask about. And once, with her own two hardened hands, by every single day since. The house stood behind her, roofed and floored and lit now from within by her own fire. The bees hummed on into the dusk. And Eleanor Vance, no longer anyone's servant, sat on her own step, on her own land, and was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply and entirely at peace.